Number 4. Kathleen Steele was born in Chicago, Illinois, and she moved to St. Petersburg, Florida in 1972. She married a man named Philip, and they decided to focus on their careers instead of starting a family. Then in the late 2000s, when they were both in their 50s, they decided they wanted to have children. In 2009, Kathleen was pregnant and she was 55 years old. She was the subject of the aptly named documentary I'm Pregnant and I'm 55, which aired on the USA Network in 2009. That pregnancy resulted in a son. In 2011, 2 years after their son was born, Kathleen's husband, Philip, who was 66, died from cancer. But Kathleen wasn't done giving birth to children fathered by Philip. A year after Philip's death, Kathleen was impregnated with Philip's frozen sperm. This pregnancy also resulted in a son. 2 years later, in late 2015, Kathleen was again pregnant with her dead husband's child. On July 26, 2016, Kathleen gave birth to a daughter named Kathleen Bridget. 13 days after the birth, Kathleen had to run some errands, so she loaded her 3 kids, 2 who were conceived after their father was already dead, into her minivan. First, she stopped at a cell phone repair shop. She left her 2 sons, who were 6 and 3, with Kathleen Bridget, who was 13 days old, in the van. It was August and they were in Florida, but Kathleen didn't leave the van on, and she kept the windows rolled up. For 28 minutes, Kathleen stayed in the store. When she returned to the van, her oldest son told her that something was wrong with the baby. He told her that it was serious, but Kathleen ignored him. She made 2 more stops and then returned home. It was only then that she noticed that 13-day-old Kathleen Bridget's face was blue. Despite it being obvious that something was wrong with the baby, she did not call 911. Instead, she asked her neighbor, who was a registered nurse, for some help. The neighbor was horrified to find the baby unresponsive, and she was the one who called 911. The baby was rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. Before she was 2 weeks old, Kathleen Bridget's life was over. The medical examiner said that the infant had suffered multiple head wounds. He said that her skull had fractures that were like cracks in the sidewalk. The police interviewed Kathleen's eldest son, who was 6 years old. He said that while his mother was in the cell phone repair shop, the baby started crying. He got her out of her car seat, and then he slammed her head into the roof of the minivan. He picked her up and dropped her a few more times. He then put her back in the car seat. The boy wasn't charged with any crimes because he was only 6 years old. In May 2017, Kathleen pleaded guilty to leaving a child unattended in a vehicle causing injury. She was sentenced to 6 years probation. She lost custody of her 2 sons, but she was granted supervised visits while she is on probation. Number 3. Potslow is a small town in northeast Germany, not far from the Polish border. In 2002, the town only had 576 residents. One of those residents was a quiet 16-year-old boy named Marinus Skolboy. Marinus didn't have many friends, but he wanted more, and he tried to befriend the other young men in the town. Marinus had a stutter, and this made him shy and self-conscious. He liked hip-hop music, and he wore baggy pants. He had recently bleached his hair, so it was blonde. On the night of July 13th, 2002, he didn't come home, and his father reported him missing. 4 months later, a tip came in to the police. Following the tip, the police went to an abandoned pig farm, and in a cesspool, they found Marinas' remains. Based on the information in the tip, the police arrested 3 young men who were only identified by their first names. They were 18-year-old Marcel, his 23-year-old brother Marco, and their friend, 18-year-old Sebastian. Both Marcel and Sebastian were 17 years old when Marinas went missing. All 3 boys were neo-Nazi skinheads. They said that on the night Marinas went missing, they were drinking beer and listening to hard rock music. Then they decided to go out and find someone to beat up. They came across Marinas. Marcel and Sebastian knew him from school. The 3 young men started talking to him, and then they said he looked Jewish. Marinas, who wasn't Jewish, told them he wasn't Jewish. They either didn't believe him, or they didn't care, and they started punching him until he called himself a Jew. Then they forced him to sit on the handlebars of one of their bikes, and they rode out to an abandoned farm. For 3 or 4 hours, Marcel, his brother, and their friend Sebastian beat and tortured the 16-year-old boy. Then they brought him to a concrete pig trough. They told him to bite onto the edge of the trough. Marinas did as he was told. Then 17-year-old Marcel jumped on the back of his head. Marcel said he got the idea from watching American History X. The curb stomp didn't kill Marinas. So Marcel grabbed a concrete stone and dropped it twice on his head. Then the young man dumped his body in the cesspool. After brutally ending the 16-year-old's life, the 3 young men went home and went to bed. 4 months later, Marcel bragged to 4 friends that he knew where Marinas was, and he took them to the cesspit. One girl who saw the remains went to the police the next day. On October 24, 2003, Marcel was convicted of murder, and he was sentenced to 8.5 years in prison. His brother Marco was sentenced to 15 years in prison, and Sebastian was sentenced to 2 years in juvenile detention. Marcel, who is considered the primary aggressor in the murder, was released in October 2010. Number 2. On Valentine's Day 2002, 19-year-old Stephanie Lopez gave birth to a daughter named Brianna Mariah. After giving birth, Stephanie took the baby to go live in a mobile home in La Cruces, New Mexico. Also living in the mobile home was Stephanie's boyfriend and the father of Brianna, Andy Walters. Andy's mother, Patricia Walters, owned the mobile home, and she lived there as well. But they weren't the only people living in the mobile home. Patricia had a boyfriend who lived there as well, and Andy's older brother also lived there with his girlfriend. Stephanie had an 18-month-old son, and he lived there too. Finally, Stephanie's 19-year-old twin brother, Steven, somehow managed to live in the trailer as well. In case you lost count, there were 7 adults and 2 babies living in the mobile home. At 10 a.m. on July 19, 2012, Stephanie called 911. She said that Brianna, who was 5.5 months old, wasn't breathing. An ambulance arrived and took the baby to the hospital. Sadly, she was pronounced dead 70 minutes later at 11:10 a.m. Because of the condition of Brianna's body, the police and the district attorney were called to the hospital. The medical examiner said that every single body part of Brianna was bruised. There were new bruises, and bruises in various stages of healing. She had fractures in her skull, arms, legs, and ribs. She also had 15 bite marks on her tiny body. There were also signs that she had been sexually assaulted, both vaginally and anally. You can find the photographs taken just before the autopsy on the internet, but I do not recommend it. The police rounded up all the adults who were living in the mobile home. Brianna's parents, Andy and Stephanie, along with Stephanie's brother, Steven, said that it started the night before they called 911. Andy said that on his way home from work, he picked up a case of beer. Stephanie said she drank 3 beers and then she went to bed. Andy and Steven stayed up drinking. At some point in the evening, they started playing with Brianna. Andy said that Steven picked up the baby and threw her in the air. The baby hit the ceiling and fell to the floor. He picked her up off the floor and threw her in the air again, and once again she hit the ceiling and fell to the floor. Then he picked her up again and threw her into the ceiling one more time, but this time he caught her on the way down. Andy said that Brianna was conscious and crying when he went to bed, but he didn't remember where he put the baby when he went to sleep. Stephanie said she got up after midnight and she found Brianna lying on the floor. She said she changed her diaper and then put her into her crib. Stephanie then went back to bed. They said they woke up and they found Brianna unresponsive. However, the police knew that wasn't the entire story, because while it explained some of Brianna's injuries, it did not explain them all. So Stephanie, Andy, and Steven were all interviewed again. This time Andy said that Stephanie would pinch, bite, and throw Brianna whenever she became annoyed with her. Andy, who was Brianna's father, said that he sexually assaulted her anally with his finger. Steven, who was Brianna's uncle, also made a horrifying confession. He said he was really drunk, and he said he didn't remember starting to do it, but he found himself vaginally raping Brianna. He said he stopped because he realized it was wrong. The police and the district attorney still didn't think that they were telling the full story, because the medical examiner thought that the baby had been injured or was abused every day of her short life. Nevertheless, the trio and 2 other family members were charged with a series of crimes. Brianna's father, Andy Walters, was sentenced to 63 years in prison. Andy's mother and brother, who lived in the mobile home, were convicted of failing to report the abuse. They were both sentenced to 60 days in jail. Brianna's mother, Stephanie, was sentenced to 27 years in prison. Her twin brother, Steven, was sentenced to 57 years in prison. Stephanie's sentence was the maximum she could receive for child abuse, resulting in death. A condition of the sentence was that she could shave off time for good behavior. As a result, she was released in September 2016 after serving 13 years of her sentence. People were outraged that Stephanie, who had either been involved or overlooked the abuse of her infant to the point where she died, could get such a lenient sentence. After Brianna's death, a new law was created in her name, which gives mandatory sentences for child abuse resulting in the death of a child under the age of 13. Number 1. On the night of November 26, 1986, Josefina Rivera got into a fight with her boyfriend. Rivera, who was a sex worker, left their apartment, which was in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and started walking the streets looking for a John. She was hoping to make enough money to buy Thanksgiving dinner for her family. But she didn't come home that night or the next day. Her boyfriend just assumed she had run off, and he didn't report her missing. But Rivera didn't run away. Instead, she had gotten into a brand new silver and white Cadillac Coupe de Ville. The car was driven by Gary Heidnik. Heidnik was born in Eastlake, Ohio in November 1943. When he was a toddler, his parents got divorced. He lived with his mother until he started school, and then Heidnik went to live with his father and stepmother. As a child, Heidnik had a bedwetting problem, and he was often ridiculed about it by his father. His father would hang his wet bed sheets outside the window in full view of the neighbors. During his childhood, Heidnik fell from a tree, and he suffered a head injury that left his head misshapen. He was often teased and bullied because of the shape of his head. When he was young, Heidnik became obsessed with becoming a member of the military police. Heidnik joined the army when he was 18, but he was disappointed when he was put into training as a medic and he was stationed in Germany. After 14 months, Heidnik was discharged because he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. Some people who knew Heidnik said he was faking it because he didn't want to be a medic. But several doctors don't believe he was faking it. After he was discharged, Heidnik stayed in a psychiatric hospital several times. His family also had a history of mental illness. His brother was committed to a psychiatric hospital a few times. Also, when Heidnik was 27, his mother died by suicide. In 1971, Heidnik was in California and he had a revelation. When he was discharged from the army, he was given $1,500. He decided to start his own church, and he would put the money into the church's account, which meant he wouldn't have to pay any taxes on the money. He called the church the United Church of the Ministers of God, and he named himself Bishop. The church eventually amassed followers. At its peak, Heidnik had a following of about 50 people. Heidnik was incredibly good at investing. He invested the money he got from his Army disability pay, Social Security, and his followers at the church. Then, in the church's name, he invested the money so that it would all be tax-free. This included investing in Playboy. From his investments, Heidnik eventually made $750,000. With the money, he bought a 1987 Cadillac Coupe de Ville and a 1971 Rolls-Royce. In 1978, Heidnik signed his girlfriend's sister out of a psychiatric hospital. The woman had a severe mental disability. Heidnik raped her and locked her up in a storage room in the basement of his house. Staff from the hospital went to Heidnik's house and they found the woman. Heidnik was arrested and charged with kidnapping and rape. He was convicted and he was sentenced to 3 to 7 years in prison. He ended up serving 3 years in a psychiatric hospital and he was released in April 1983. In 1986, Heidnik was charged with spousal rape, but those charges were dismissed when his accuser didn't show up to testify. Not long after beating those charges, he brought Josefina Rivera home. Once he got her inside his house, he forced her into the basement and chained her up in a pit that he had dug. He explained to her that he always wanted a big family. He said that he had 4 kids with 4 women and he wasn't in contact with any of them. He said he planned to chain up 10 women and get them all pregnant. He then walked upstairs and left her in the basement. Rivera was able to get out of her shackles and she tried to climb out a basement window. But she couldn't get out, so she screamed for help. The only person's attention she caught was Heidnik's. He came back into the basement and started beating her with a stick. He chained her back up, but this time he made her sit, and then he forced her head down towards her chest. He put a board over her shoulders and her neck, and then put heavy objects on it. He left her in that position, which caused her to struggle to breathe. Before Heidnik left the basement, he turned on a radio to a hard rock station and turned up the volume so no one would hear Rivera if she screamed. He left her in that position for 27 agonizing hours. When Heidnik returned to the basement, he had another woman with him. Heidnik removed the board that sat on Rivera's shoulders and the back of her neck and allowed her to stand up, but she remained chained up. Then Heidnik went back upstairs. Rivera talked to the woman, who was also chained up, and learned that her name was Sandra Lindsay, and she was a friend of Heidnik's. They had met years earlier in a psychiatric hospital. Rivera could tell that Lindsay had a severe mental disability. For the next several weeks, Gary beat, tortured, and raped the two women. After Lindsay went missing, her mother started looking for her. She went to the police and told them that she thought that a man named Gary was involved in her disappearance. She even gave the police his phone number and his address. The police called Heidnik on the phone and knocked on his door, but they never got a response, so they just assumed that Lindsay ran away. Nearly a month after Rivera and Lindsay were kidnapped, Heidnik brought home a third woman. 19-year-old Lisa Thomas was not a sex worker, but Heidnik had convinced her to come back to his home nevertheless. Once there, he chained her up with the other two women in the pit in the basement. 10 days later, he brought home Deborah Dudley. While the other three women were eventually beaten into submission, Dudley was defiant of Heidnik. For acting out against him, Heidnik beat all the women. On January 18, 1987, about 2 weeks after Dudley was kidnapped, Heidnik brought home 18-year-old Jacqueline Askins, who was a sex worker. She was chained up in the pit with the four other women. When Heidnik would leave the house, he would put one of the women in charge. When he got home, he would ask the woman in charge who misbehaved. If she singled out one of her fellow captives, he would force her to help him beat and torture the woman. If she didn't give a name, all 5 women were beaten. Heidnik would feed his captives sporadically. Sometimes he would bring them something like Chinese food, but other times he served them dog food, and he would beat them until they ate it. The hole was about 4 feet deep, and it was covered with a piece of plywood. One day in February 1987, Heidnik caught Sandra Lindsay trying to move the plywood that covered the hole. He pulled her out of the pit, and he beat her. Then he put one of her wrists in a pair of handcuffs, and he attached the other end of the handcuffs to a beam in the ceiling. He left her that way for days. Lindsay did not want to eat, so Heidnik force-fed her. She ran a fever and she was vomiting, but Heidnik continued to force-feed her. Then she lost consciousness, and Heidnik dumped her body in the pit. While Lindsay lay at the bottom of the pit with the 4 other women still in it, Heidnik served them ice cream. After the morbid ice cream party, Heidnik left the basement for a bit, and then he came back and checked on Lindsay. The 24-year-old woman was dead. Heidnik carried her body upstairs, and hours later, the 4 women heard an electric saw. What they heard was Heidnik dismembering the body. He gave some of the bones to his dogs. One of the dogs went into the basement, carrying a large bone in his mouth. The dog then gnawed on the bone in front of the 4 women. Heidnik put the meat of Lindsay's body through a meat grinder. Supposedly, he mixed the ground meat with dog food and he fed it to his captives. To get rid of the rest of the body, Hynek cooked the body parts. The stink attracted the attention of the neighbors, and they called the police. An officer went to Hynek's house, and he told them that he had burned a roast. This was a good enough explanation for the police officer, and he left without checking the house. Over time, Hynek developed a favorite among the women, and that was his first captive, Josefina Rivera. He would give her special treatment, but he would also make her join in when he beat and tortured the other women. While Hynek had a favorite among the women, he also had a least favorite. That was Deborah Dudley. Even though she had been chained up for months in the pit, she was still defiant. After Sandra Lindsay died, Hynek brought Dudley into the kitchen. He showed her the pot that contained Lindsay's head, and then he opened the oven and showed her that he was roasting her ribs. After that, Dudley was quiet for a while, and then Hynek thought she regained her defiant streak. After a few months, Hynek developed a new way to injure the women. He would take a live electrical cord and touch it against their chains. He then thought of a diabolical way to step up the torture. Hynek had Rivera pour water into the pit, and then he would stick a live electrical cord into the water, and all three women in the pit would be electrocuted. He then forced them to live in the flooded pit in the cold basement. On March 18, 1987, the women were being tortured, and the electrical cord was put down into the hole. It made contact with Dudley's chin. She screamed and then fell into the water, convulsing. Hynek pulled her out of the pit and concluded the 23-year-old was dead. Hynek made the three remaining women sandwiches and said, "Are you glad it wasn't you?" He then made Rivera get a piece of paper and a pen. He forced her to write the date, and then he made her confess to being involved in the murder of Dudley. He told her that if she ever went to the police, he would use the letter to show she was an accomplice. He then let her go upstairs by herself and get dressed. It was the first time in 4 months she was able to wear clothes. The next day, Hynek wrapped up Dudley's body in plastic and put her in the freezer. After the murder, Hynek began to take Rivera out of the house to go to restaurants and to go on shopping excursions. She also helped him dump Dudley's body in a wooded area in New Jersey. On March 23, 1987, the day after dumping Dudley's body, Rivera went with Hynek while he looked for another captive. They found Agnes Adams, who was a sex worker, and convinced her to come back to Hynek's house. Once there, she too was chained up in the pit in the basement. For helping him get Adams back to the house, Rivera asked if she could meet with her family for a few hours. She promised him that if she let her, she would bring him another woman. Hynek reluctantly agreed to let Rivera visit her family. Later that day, he dropped her off at the apartment that she shared with her boyfriend. He told her that he would pick her up later that evening, and he expected her to have another woman with her. Rivera had other plans. As soon as she walked into her apartment, she convinced her boyfriend to call the police. At first, the police didn't believe her story, but she was able to convince them she was telling the truth. Hynek was put under arrest, and his house was searched. The police found the 3 women in the pit, and they also found traces of Sandra Lindsay's cooked body. Hynek pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, and he pointed to his history of schizophrenia as proof of this. However, several people testify that Hynek bragged about faking the disease and being able to manipulate the tests. Also, the representative at Merrill Lynch who worked with Heidnik testified that he always came across as competent and shrewd. In June 1988, Heidnik was found guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to death. He sat on death row for 11 years. On the night of July 6, 1999, he was executed via lethal injection